So once again, thank you very much for joining today. And we are here for the Introducing Giza Advanced Performance and Analytics for Streaming Imagery webinar, where we'll be focusing specifically on brand new solutions and solution sets, for that matter, within the high-resolution imagery space. And within that realm, we'll be showing off some examples of some new solution sets within Giza that can hopefully drum up some ideas within the audience. And we'll get started right away. So next slide, please. And without further ado, your host today, first of all, we have David Breeding, principal at AppGeo, a contributor on numerous AppGeo projects, and our product lead of our product team. And he's developed awesome products like the one you see today in Giza. Joined by David for this webinar and the Q&A session will be Aaron Doucett. Many of you are well acquainted with Aaron by now, as he hosts many of our webinars. And I will just give Aaron the mic and have him take it from here.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jordan. And thank you, everyone who's coming on board with us today. I see our attendee numbers start ticking up here, so I'm excited to get this show on the road. I'm going to walk you through our agenda for today, starting with introducing applied geographics and what we're all about. And then I'm going to talk to you all about cloud storage and imagery streaming options, what is changing in the marketplace and how we see this world kind of evolving. And then David's going to talk a bit about the Giza solution that AppGeo has developed and how it can really improve your decision making when it comes to your imagery program and some of the other benefits we've seen in that area. I wanted to introduce AppGeo and give you a sense of who we are and where we come into the picture. So, we've been around the block a few times, and in those 30 years, AppGeoers have worked on pretty much every type of aerial product you can think of, from imagery to drones to LiDAR. There's a lot in our history. And I think that's one of the great things about our team is that we get to see and use imagery in our work and all those geospatial tools that go with it from so many different perspectives. And there's a lot of creativity that goes on within those walls and across the company that goes into our problem-solving approach. So in the last few years, we've gone from being a Google candid imagery provider to a Hexagon partner, all companies that are involved in the imagery space. And we've spent these most recent couple of years really thinking long and hard about what the future is going to look like for imagery. That's why we lent a hand to Texas, Utah, California, and a variety of other states. We like to call them the trailblazer states who are venturing out into that next frontier when it comes to imagery. And that's a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. So let's start off by examining just how the imagery world is changing, and specifically how your own organization or state is using imagery and how that might evolve over time. As sensors and data become more fine and more detailed with more resolution seemingly every year, the first thought we've had is just about how much more you can do with imagery in terms of the use cases that are out there. Suddenly activities that required a crew in the field can be done from the desktop, and new forms of analysis let us observe change year over year. But all these great new possibilities put increased strain on your current imagery infrastructure. So let's take a look at what that means. Specifically, we're seeing both larger and increasing number of individual data sets as we add additional bands to our collection technology, increased specificity of the data needs like leaf on and leaf off. But we also have more users as more departments start seeing the value imagery can add to their workflow. And of course, with more users comes more use cases and vice versa, right? It's a repeating loop. And now your GIS team is supporting quite a lot more activity in this space. And with more users, of course, comes more platforms that need to access this data. It's not just your GIS desktop suite anymore. There's quite a lot of other programs like CAD, and the list goes on from there, that can all consume this kind of imagery. And lastly, all of this comes at a cost of increased bandwidth on top of other demands across your IT infrastructure. And we're seeing this change happen in real time in more than just the public sector. So let's see what that looks like. Specifically, we've seen use cases growing among agriculture, insurance, and real estate users, engineering and transportation, especially when multiple firms need to collaborate on the same project, some of these big projects out there. Now, these are all areas that we would consider legacy imagery users. You guys are the pros. Some of you have been working with imagery since the Grateful Dead was on tour, right? But especially as we get to that higher level of detail and new avenues like machine learning and artificial intelligence, well, they say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, but I have a feeling we're going to be seeing a lot more come out of these spaces down the road. Now, these industries you see on the screen here or we see a lot of growth opportunities, especially as we have changes in so many aspects of how we do business, commerce, and industry. Within energy and renewables, for example, we have customers who use imagery to identify potential properties for solar farms or even do analysis on their existing panels. And it's definitely also worth mentioning public safety here. This is an area that AppGeo has been heavily involved in, committed to. There's a lot going on in this space, especially if you ask Bill Johnson about it. But, better imagery is unlocking improved PSAP operations and even helping facilitate search and rescue in some cases, really cool stuff. So all things to be aware of as we're getting into that higher level of detail. Now, here's a quick timeline I put together, and we can take a look where we came from when it comes to imagery, and specifically that imagery access and storage piece. So historically, as you see on the left here, everyone had their own copy of the imagery sitting on the hard drive, and all that processing and analysis took place locally. Now, this can be great, but it puts a lot of demand on that one machine to be correctly equipped and have all the right storage and software. It's a lot of individual configuration. And as teams grew and the need for collaboration increased, that's where we start moving toward the right here. We have networked approaches, and this improves that shareability aspect. But of course, now you're pulling a lot of data over your network, and you're still requiring that specialized software to read the data depending on how it was processed. And over the last few years, with some of the advancements that have been out, we've seen organizations move to a hosted solution. Although historically this has been stood up on their own infrastructure, of course, this opened up the whole world of like WMS and WMTS streaming acronyms I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And moving into the cloud is truly where we see the industry going if you're not already there. It was when our customers started getting into this last bucket that AppGeo said, hey, we think there's an opportunity here to make this better and unlock a few new things that have never really been possible before. So what does that mean when we talk about going into the cloud? The tech giants of the world, as you see in this little cloud shape here, they've been competing to see who can get more innovative in this space. And you have a lot of options, and they come with some really significant advantages. And remember that all these companies are competing with each other on price. That is their distinguishing factor, really, which equals a win for you as the buyer. And we've been working with this same cloud technology to host some of our most critical applications, and have had really strong results even when disasters hit, like Hurricane Harvey in 2017 for our Texas customers, and also in the Virgin Islands, who had their data center take damage from Hurricane Irma also in 2017. And AppGeo was able to help with that digital response. But having data either backed up or primarily hosted in the cloud means you can always get to it no matter where you are in the world. So just thinking about some of those bullets there for advantages. Now, this leads us to two key ways where we see our customers working with imagery in this modern era. And one of those being tiling your own imagery. So let's talk about that for a moment. Image tiling and raster pyramids are actually nothing new, of course. These approaches have been built into GIS applications for some time. But the ability to pre-tile and pre-render this data ahead of time for mass distribution has really changed the game. So many of you will already be aware of how this works at a technological level. But essentially, we're just breaking down the very large image data, a statewide picture, which could be many terabytes or petabytes, into these bite-sized chunks that can be downloaded rapidly over the web at the exact zoom level you need when you need it. It's on demand effectively. Now, the other advantage here, thinking again to our customers who might have imagery libraries going back multiple decades, wouldn't it be nice to have all this data immediately accessible to you? This again goes back to the age-old problem we face in this technological world. We don't want to throw anything out. So by building up these libraries, which are only going to grow and grow and grow over the years, we want an efficient way to access all that data. And that's why the cloud is a great place to do it. You're not clogging up your own basement or your on-prem storage with all this archived imagery for every year for the past 30 years. And we also have some cool use cases in the change detection space that open up once you have, multiple years and years to compare to side by side. So think about that for some of that change detection. So moving on, and this is going to be our second way our customers are getting imagery nowadays, is content programs. And a big theme for our company over the past year and past couple years has been looking at what we like to call the imagery renaissance, and that many users are switching to a content program model more so than any time before. And this follows trends throughout the rest of the technology landscape where streaming is becoming the norm, from entertainment like Netflix and Spotify for music, and then software that we actually install on our computers as well. A license model has a lot of benefits for the end user, but it can take some getting used to. We've looked at the range of options and have helped several states make that switch, as we've mentioned before. And some of the benefits you can see here on the right include like lower overall costs, a simplified buying process, and of course, having access to the latest and the greatest as soon as it comes out. And we've seen companies start to adapt their programs to better fit statewide implementations, which is what Content Plus from Hexagon is doing. They just rolled that out, and it allows for more control over the data that the state's receiving and potentially more flexible terms in that licensing. It's all legal jargon, but they're adapting it to fit what you really need as the customer. So, here's like a scattering in that box there of some of the vendors offering this. There's a whole lot more. And you can see here even more examples. So whether you're coming in with your own data and moving it into the cloud, or you're taking advantage of one of these number of growing services that are already relying on cloud hosting, that's where they're keeping the data, we can help you make your end user and the behind the scenes experience much better. And that's where Giza comes into the picture. So that brings us to the star of the show today, and that's Giza. And now that imagery is heading into the cloud, we wanted to find a way to deliver it efficiently while taking on some new analytical capabilities that were never really possible when everyone had their own copy. Now, here's where it's kind of funny. My own story with Giza personally predates me even working with AppGeo. And when I was a consultant in the GIS world, I was working on some state transportation projects and needed access to that latest and greatest imagery from our state GIS office. And when I requested this imagery, what I got back wasn't a hard drive full of files. It was a simple link that looked like this. Plug it in and boom, I'm using that imagery. And it was faster than any of the other services that I had access to at the time, including the stuff that was on our own network. So for a lot of your users, that's all the configuration they're ever going to have to do. Plugging in a simple link that looks like that into their software. That is to them Giza. And then they're going to get, a pretty picture like that in their software and they're good to go. But those seemingly random words you see there in the middle, those are actually that user's unique login. It's built right into the URL, meaning that link only works for that one person or the agency for which it was assigned. And on their screen, they're getting access to the imagery. And in the background, Giza can be tracking all sorts of metrics, which David's going to get into here in a little bit. And as for the pyramids, you kind of seen a running theme here through this presentation. That's an homage to those tiling periods that make it all work. And of course, the world's most famous pyramids are in the ancient city of Giza. So that's where the name Giza comes from. So from here, I'd like to hand things over to David to go a bit deeper into what makes Giza special and how some of our existing statewide customers have found immense value after using it for several years now. So David, would you like to take the stage?
Yeah, would love to. And thanks for teeing it up for me, Aaron. If we could just kind of clip over and take off the next slide. So, Aaron did a great job kind of just describing a little bit about what Giza is to the users. I want to kind of expose a little bit more how it can be leveraged by kind of the administrative side, the entity that is in charge of making this all happen. It's about getting those tiles to your users, and we've been doing it for a number of states, and we've been developing it for a number of years alongside these states and other smaller entities that have been taking advantage of the technology. So, but I really want to kind of, well, why? Well, what's the problem? A little bit of it's been laid out already, but kind of to distill it. you have, organizations need to get an effective way to get this content, this imagery data, into those desirable formats or protocols, and really control who has access to that. And that's the problem. It's pretty easy to say, but as your data volumes grow, or as your users demands or the number kind of grow, like what each needs can start to present some technical challenges, and we've designed Giza to address many of those. Next slide. And just talk about the solution, right? So what is it? Giza delivers really high performant imagery access to tile repositories that are stored in the cloud, or connects up to these streaming services that we've been talking about via OGC standards, and ways in which you can kind of communicate and ask for the data. And it's extremely easy to configure imagery and track that usage. What are people actually doing with it once they get their link and start interacting with it. And just as an example of the configuration, you'll see an image on the right-hand side, which is in California, obviously. But there's statewide imagery for California, but a configuration that Giza has is we can take a unique vector geometry and trim exactly what we want to present to that specific user. So, for the DOT use case, they just wanted imagery around the area where the roads are. And so, this is done on the fly. It's extremely powerful in how you want to kind of segment what goes out and control that kind of experience. So, and understand where and how they're using it. So that ability to track and create value around that, we'll talk a lot more about it. But to distill it, it's about availability, minimizing those storage costs, measuring your impact, and improving using this facility to really improve the quality of the program or the service that you're trying to kind of bring to your users. So I talked about OGC. OGC compliance standards. What that means is WMS and WMTS, web mapping services or web mapping tile services, and just the ways in which platforms often communicate. There are other proprietary ways in which people can request imagery. Esri, for example, has Arc Server, and they have their endpoints for delivering tiles, which are some of them, they do have open conventions, but we focused on making sure to use these open source conventions or well-defined kind of mechanisms so that it can work in Autodesk, it can work on your CAD software, it can work in QGIS, it can work in Esri, it can work where your users do work, and people that are bringing products and platforms to the market that want to work with imagery or enrich the user experience, they're very likely going to use these standards. So that's why we select them, and that's why we watch those standards develop and make sure that we are continuing to kind of make sure we have the access points in Giza that people need. Next slide. But in addition to that desktop work, in addition to those kind of more heavy resources that people, geospatial kind of experts, like to work with, you can also just request Giza via your web maps, whether they're using Google Maps as the map control, or Carto, or Mapbox, or the Here kind of resourcing. Giza can just provide that. We have our X, Y, and Z tile parameters, and that just kind of can layer right in to your application. And again, that same performance that users are going to see on their platforms or within their applications is going to be available on the web. And so again, putting the tiles where people need the access is kind of the name of the game. But when we think about this game that we're playing, right? Speed is important. High speed is required. Performant modern applications need that. The user experience people are shooting for just require ideally sub-second access to the content that they seek to present. Otherwise, you're going to start to lose attention. Giza's WMS service, WMTS service does that. We are below what we kind of define as that threshold, that floor, that 1 second floor. We focus on that. That's where we are. And just to kind of talk about the problem, yeah, if you're going over a second, our attention has been commoditized. Everyone wants our attention. So if people are being distracted or they're waiting for their tiles to load or their imagery to come in, they could be looking somewhere else and ultimately taking potentially a hit to productivity if it's important. If you're trying to serve a group that's performing a function, that's something that is a result of maybe having a less than performant service. And so mentioning speed, we are aiming to be under half a second. At that level, we think that's a really great place to be. But when we think about speed, like I mentioned, the floor of a second, people, that's where we honestly focus more attention. It's not about going faster, because people aren't going to complain if it's going too fast, or at some point it's just there, it's just instantaneous. So where we really like to focus is on the tail, on that 95 and 99th percentile, where that performance, what is the performance there? Because you're going to hear from the user if it's going too slow. And so we're really looking on kind of elevating the floor where possible, and making the right infrastructure selections to continue to do that as the demand from our clients, or the demand or the experience that's kind of expected in the market. That's what we continue to apply our efforts to at Giza. And just at the bottom, there's a lot more. There's been some research done about attention and what's expected within a web environment. And so that was kind of how we tried to formulate and focus on what we needed to do from a performance perspective when it comes to speed. But really, after we have speed, right, it's getting there. What I really want to talk about is about the usage, and what makes Giza really, really special in our opinion. People spend a lot of time acquiring the data, thinking about it, getting it, provisioning it. But once that's done, once that project and effort has been done, we were seeing just not a lot of effort being kind of applied to understand how it's actually being used. When we were building Giza, it was happening when big data was peaking, right, in the market, where people are like, what's all this? How do I manage it? What is it? And so when we were developing, we're thinking about that and this stream of requests that are coming through. We need to get the tiles to the user, and we just recognize that, whoa, there's value here. And so when we were thinking about user control and like how we're going to provision access, we said we need to capture this. We need to kind of store not only where the tiles were, requested for, where spatially those tiles are, but who requested them. And then also tag it with a variety of other metadata about the group that they're involved in, or another special tag. And so every tile that flows through, we are capturing that information and storing it in, a BigQuery. It's a Google kind of big data platform, which really gives us a lot of power. And that platform continues to have more spatial kind of resourcing to really do some interesting analytics. But so, quantifying, the solution, quantifying that volume of usage, where it is, who's using what, and using that to kind of help you prioritize your efforts, to kind of go and think about what flights you need to be, maybe there is a case for custom collect because your particular user group is really focused in one place, but having the information to help you make good decisions it was a game changer for some of our clients. And I'm going to describe a little bit in more detail some stories about how these analytics are really helping some of our customers. And so I want to start with what's common when people are thinking about procuring it. It's about leaf on or leaf off. Do we need it? Who has it? Where can I get it? Where is it important? And so just to take a moment and kind of talk about how Giza helped. Georgia is one of our clients. We went to their usership. We went to the analytics that Giza has to help them try to make an informed decision about whether or not they should be going after or kind of excluding options that didn't have the leaf off kind of content. And so we went to, what you're looking on the left-hand side is a heat map. Very familiar to many people that do mapping, but this is an expression of that usership data. And as you zoom in, we have granularity down to that tile level that people are requesting, counts of usership by who is using what. And so that granularity of data, we essentially took that, okay, where is this usage occurring over a set of time? We have control to look at time bands by, again, your question can be defined. We have a lot of control over when, who, and where. But you want to intersect that with what you're looking on the right-hand side is a representation of flight blocks. As Aaron mentioned at the top, we were a Google a candid imagery reseller, and Google was flying the country and would fly at the time which they flew the state. So you ended up having a patchwork of flights that occurred during leaf on periods and during leaf off periods. So essentially, it's basically a simple intersect. Again, this didn't happen in the Giza platform, but we supported our customer, and it's pretty easy to export that data and do this analysis to say, okay, how much usage occurred where there was leaf off or leaf on imagery as a proxy for kind of trying to help you make the decision, or at least align your criteria for purchase in a way that allows you to make a good decision. And there was this this feeling going in, about what the state required. They were thinking leaf on was extremely important, and they were ranking it accordingly in their decision making. But what the data ended up showing us is that where a lot of the usage was occurring was actually, these boundaries were actually with leaf on imagery. Make sure I get that right. Where there was actually leaves, and so that this need for leaf off was, they could kind of deprioritize that. They still wanted to talk to their users to make sure they had good alignment, but this was a powerful tool for them to be confident in their approach and to kind of go evaluate what's out there when they're thinking about bringing in new content. So that's one story. We'll have a few more. We, from the very beginning of Giza, we were working with TNRIS, Texas Natural Resource Information Service or System, excuse me. So with the state of Texas, and they had a goal to kind of, they wanted to improve how they were kind of delivering imagery. And where they started, where maybe others are, is they were actually providing hard copies of imagery. They had a massive volume of imagery. They were sending hard copies to people who needed it. And they just kind of were like, we want to have a service that provides 24/7 access to all this imagery in the ways they require it, and can actually get at this content, and can download the imagery, which is a capability of Giza, assuming the raw imagery is associated with the platform. But so we kind of started, our journey kind of started very closely with the TNRIS need, and that's kind of how we developed some of the requirements here. But provisioning that securely, provisioning that effectively for the state, and then ultimately building around this platform the user setup. So as you'll see on the screen right here, how TNRIS has configured, and this is a kind of mocked up example, but there are user types. There are groups of users that they want to know how much imagery they're using, and they can actually provision a certain spatial allotment. And then they came up with a model that allowed them to kind of effectively share some of the cost, or have a fair funding model, so that these users, based upon their usership, where they're using it, were paying an appropriate kind of amount to make sure that the program could be maintained, and to make sure that they could have Giza and the imagery that flows through it when they needed it. And so it's been a really effective way for TNRIS and the state of Texas to have great service, and to also understand, similar to Georgia, like, where do they need to go do some additional imagery acquisitions? Where are those users that are, the DOT is a kind of consumer. Where are they doing their work? Can they plan? Can they see where this activity is taking place to make sure they're bringing in the right content, so that the most accurate imagery is available where the highest value work is taking place. So again, TNRIS is kind of using Giza to track and appropriately allocate and charge for imagery service within their state. But beyond, so this is the provisioning side of things we're describing, making sure it's going to the right people, making sure that you can measure what's going on. There is also, the storage side of things. We're talking about tile storage, and really a part of the Giza product. There is no included storage associated with the product. We will work with you on, if you have tiles, let's consume it from where that is, or if you want to create tiles, let's put it in storage that makes the most sense. We use actually with TNRIS again, we use their imagery to kind of evaluate who is using what imagery and at what level, and did it make sense to continue to keep that imagery stored in a certain varietal of storage. We are Google partners. We use their Google infrastructure, and the opportunity we saw was some of the historic versions. There's many older years over time. I think TNRIS amassed, it's like 250 or 60 terabytes of data, so a massive volume. We kind of came up and used the analytics to kind of move discrete tile repositories into a more affordable storage that had some lower costs associated with it, and just kind of talk through the dynamics of, and when you select a storage regime, there's region kind of considerations. There's where your users are actually calling the data from to consider in here when you're making these decisions. But in short, there was this opportunity we saw to kind of can maintain that speed. We were evaluating what that performance was, did some testing of it, and found that we could get some pretty great performance that was within our speed bound that we defined as a good service, even using the cold line product within the Google infrastructure. So it was just, it brought lots of savings to Texas, and we continue to look at that usage as, it's kind of our common, some of the most current imagery is always in like the most available resource. So for that Texas layer, as you see on the screen, is the one that there's the primary usage. We like to make sure there's multi-regional distribution and storage of that content so that people have access. But watching that usage and making that decision so that when you're managing and maintaining this repository, you're getting the efficiencies that are available, and you're relying upon using the most cost-effective service from the cloud. We don't seek, there are other solutions out there that might give you included storage, but potentially marking up that storage. We want to give you just that cost at cost for what that storage is, and just connect to what makes the most sense for your infrastructure, whether it's Google or Amazon or Azure. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say about that. There's a lot of opportunity around the power that is Giza. But I think one thing every implementation that we've done of Giza, there's been different dynamics for each client. When you think about deploying this type of service, there's a lot of different stakeholders and concerns. And so we developed a consulting package around Giza called Spatial IQ. And really what this allows is an opportunity for us when we're kind of looking at a potential customer is to really, where necessary, depending on that organization, kind of apply some discrete support to help them, maybe from a planning perspective, thinking about where their assets are currently and how we might plug them in, or maybe need to do some work to make sure they're ready to go. Or think about tiling. This is a kind of a big one. We have this, as Aaron mentioned. People come with historic imagery. Well, how are we going to do this? AppGeo can take the raw imagery and tile it out and store it for you. But there's probably scenarios where, especially with organizations that have a lot of experience, well, you can do some tiling. You're probably familiar with the same tiling resources that we are. We can kind of collaborate, maybe support, on the transition and migration of that content. So again, working with you to figure out what's the best strategy to get this content as efficiently from where it lives today to where Giza needs access to it. And finally, the last two are kind of related as far as site configurations and kind of these custom analytics. When deploying Giza, you can kind of take on the surface, it's pretty simple in how we want to group them this way, or group them that way, tag them this way to provision access. But sometimes it could be helpful, and we've seen it be helpful to kind of have a conversation about it. Like, what are your goals? What are you trying to report on? Is there something specific? Like we've seen Texas want to kind of report out about a specific user group that's doing research, or to kind of elevate a story about the value of the imagery program. There's just embedded value in some of these analytics. So thinking kind of about those users and making sure that you're able to capture the data that you want at the other end. As every tile is being captured, right? But what is that data going to tell you? Making sure you have that right metadata associated with each user, and provisioning of a layer to kind of answer the questions you want. And custom analytics, like I mentioned, BigQuery as a resource behind the scenes. From the Giza interface, there's a SQL kind of pane where you can go and query this analytic. You can query all the data. You can kind of compose and aggregate and pull out the analytics to answer the questions that you have. We've kind of, again, under the Spatial IQ umbrella, provided support to generate some of those queries, or collaborate around how to best extract that data, or potentially maybe change a configuration of a user to try and generate the content required. So again, we're here. Connor Cousins, he's our kind of sales asset here, who's awesome. He knows the imagery side of the house, what's available. He's been using Giza for years, and he's happy to kind of give you the walkthroughs that you need to kind of get into the details. And of course, myself, I'm available. Connor can pull me in to kind of talk about how to make this happen if it's of interest to you. Next slide. But in closing, to kind of bring this all together, imagery is likely moving to the cloud. It's more affordable than keeping it, in your local infrastructure. We think there's a real case to be made for why it makes a lot of sense to have in the cloud, to make sure your users are satisfied, to make sure you kind of have the information to kind of grow and manage your program, and just deliver that value that's out there. And we're here to help. And we, would love to talk about your imagery journey, and how we might be able to support it given our experience.
Absolutely. And thank you, David, for that in-depth look at the Giza platform. Second, shout out to Connor as well. He is great to work with. And if you work with Connor, you are in good hands. And from there, I think I would like to turn it over to the Q&A and invite Jordan back to take a look at the questions that have come in. It's definitely not too late to ask one. So if you'd like to submit a question to our panel here, there is a Q&A button right on your Zoom webinar interface, and we have plenty of time to get through all of them. So Jordan, would you like to come back on and take a look at what questions have come in?
Thanks, Aaron. Yes, I'm going to stay in the background while our panelists answer these questions, but we do have a couple that have trickled through. So I do want to start with, what other kinds of data can Giza serve? Is it just for orthos, meaning, and then this means top-down orthogonal imagery, that is?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one, Aaron.
Sure thing.
So raster data, I think I called out on the slide, raster data that's well referenced can be tiled into the tile schema that Giza has. We use the Google compatible tile matrix schema. And so, yes, we can serve other types of rasters, hill shades, other raster content could be tiled hypothetically and serve. We do see some base map work that's been done. We're kind of mashing up of different layers to kind of tile. So it's not always just imagery. It can be, we can actually take multiple layers of Giza and meld them together to create that base map service.
Like a hybrid approach.
Yeah. There's a lot of options depending on what you're trying to feed, to support an application, for example, right? You want to have that really performant base map. So the work that's occurring is above that layer, and Giza plays a really, can play that role of making sure you're getting that best performance.
Yeah, I mean, how cool would it be to have like your USGS topos come in with that same kind of speed?
I love it. I would subscribe to that.
Especially for those of us that like really getting the little details of those, because there's such great content out there, in the history of cartography that for the first time can all work together really seamlessly. Yeah. So cool, very cool question.
Awesome. I'll move on to the next one. What are the implications of dumping on-site? I'm assuming on-site storage. So what are the implications of dumping on-site storage?
Well, so, migrating away from on-site storage, right? There's a lot of costs associated with doing it on-site. We've kind of worked with other states and, ballpark what that infrastructure, costs are and how is that allocated. From what we've seen in our conversations, it's that cost per gigabyte of storage is just not even comparable to kind of what you can get from a cloud provider. So yeah, I think that's one of the biggest, the cost side. There's also the human resource side of things, right? The IT infrastructure that's required to make sure the servers are up, make sure they're up to date, all those things that come along with it. And when you move to Google or Amazon or other kind of solutions, that overhead is kind of baked into that cost. They're making sure stuff's up to date.
Especially with the backup component of the question, right? Like, especially when we have those disasters hit, you could have all the on-site backups you want, but if your data center is taken down by a storm or outage, that could have big implications for all those users. So kind of the distribution across the world now of data has become the norm.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, David. And we will move on to the next question as well, but please keep them coming. Is there an API, for example, R, Python, etc., for regional selection by coordinates that returns arrays of images?
So actually the answer to that is yes. We have some facilities from an API perspective that can allow you to pass bounding kind of geometry and get back lists of imagery, and you can get just, it depends, streaming services and what's available as compared to the storage, the raw storage of imagery. It kind of, there is some nuance there. But Giza has the facility, depending on that asset class, the asset type that we're actually serving, to return those arrays so that you can have all of them. If there's overlapping imagery, right, you can have all of them that are in that area, or just the most current ones, the most current imagery. So yeah, we've kind of been talking about this type of facility to facilitate data pipelines, right? People wanting to do machine learning and just trying to learn from those types of users to make sure we have that facility, because at the end of the day, it's a repository of imagery, and there's often downloading of just discrete images via our UI, but we understand the future is kind of interacting with these assets programmatically. And so we have some of those resources now, but would love to kind of talk more about the requirements. And honestly, it's a living and breathing kind of application. So, but short answer, yes.
Very cool. Yeah, that download capability, I know, is a big one that people are worried about giving up. But the reality is, even some of our customers that are using the streaming type of approach, if they have their own copy of the data in the background, they're able to deliver those download tiles via Giza. So it's kind of helped meld a solution for that problem that comes up when you go to a fully streaming world.
And just on the download note, we track that as well. Who's downloading what imagery? And as kind of similar to the Georgia story, there's this conception that everyone is wanting to download this content. And the reality from the usage is that it's again, every state's different, every group's different, but it's not as much as you would expect. And so again, we have the facility to do that. If you have the raw imagery, and there's some work to kind of get that processed appropriately from an implementation perspective, but yeah, that's one of the ways that data can help you kind of really understand that usage and focus your attention where it's best placed.
Excellent. Well, it looks like our panelists are getting off easy today with just 3 questions. I will just stay on the line for a few more seconds.
And feel free to reach out to us on email too as well. Always happy to take the conversation further, especially those of you who might be viewing this webinar on a recording down the road. We are always happy to chat.
Excellent. Thank you, Aaron. And thank you, David.
Yeah, no, my pleasure.
Yeah.
We look forward to hearing from you and supporting your effort. I think there's just so many interesting questions that you can answer, and kind of feather the analytics story a little bit, just thinking about the ways that you can kind of intersect that usage with demographic, population density, other areas of interest where work is being done. How does we said we needed this imagery here, and then you could go back and see that they actually didn't use it as much as they might. There's just so many potential opportunities to kind of think about that.
I am going to cut you off, David. Actually, there is a question that came through, so exciting about that. What are derivative products? What about derivative products, from your imagery? Are those free to share? And can you talk a little bit more about restrictions?
Yeah, so if it's your imagery, right? So where did the imagery come from? About what derivatives you can create. We were Google, we worked with Google originally in their candid imagery program. And a lot of the derivative work was kind of, at least the terms of service were associated with the state itself that kind of procured that imagery, or the entity that kind of purchased that imagery. And when we look at, so to answer, are those free? You need to be working with the state oftentimes, or the entity that has the authority to kind of maybe have you act on their behalf to create a product for them, a derivative product, that is. But these restrictions kind of vary by by the service, right? We work with Hexagon currently. Yeah, the vendor, excuse me. And some are more willing to kind of talk about that. What are the derivatives you want to make? Obviously, the imagery has just so many applications, and the ML products that we're kind of thinking about, right? How do you take this? How are you doing the change detection? How are you kind of doing feature segmentation or extraction? Can you do that or not is a question on the imagery side. And Giza, we're looking to hear those use cases and make sure that we can feed those data pipelines, and so that process can go off and be supported.
And Aaron?
Yeah, I think that all makes sense. Again, in this new world, so much does come down to that agreement you have with your vendor, whether that was a custom collect flyover or one of these streaming applications. And it's a world that is constantly evolving, and we're here to help you navigate it. So we'll
I
leave
think
it
it's
at that.
worth mentioning, Aaron, we can work directly with these imagery providers like Hexagon to work out these
Yes.
licensing details as well. when it comes to derivative products, a lot of it has to do with printing out imagery and downloading it and what the difference is between those and how that's defined. So we're more than happy to do that. We can absolutely work with our providers and make something work with you, or work with, like, we can try to understand who's providing you imagery right now if you have tiles, and go from there.
Yeah. And we've seen what works, what flies and what doesn't. So we have some experience talking about it. So happy to kind of bring that to light if there's a specific kind of use case and what may or may not be agreeable. But yeah, would love to have additional conversation about what you're trying to do.
And in that regard, we do have a follow-up question. We've got contracts, you've got contracts is what was said, but we do at AppGeo with multiple states. Is the contract process well developed, or is it still a custom process for each state?
You want to take that, or I'm happy to, Aaron?
So that's really where, we're currently selling Hexagon imagery, and they saw this demand for, these individualized contracts, and that's where the whole Content Plus offering evolved from. And we just did a webinar on this topic a few weeks back, so I'd encourage you to check that out. We have Katie Fitzsimmons from Hexagon on with us talking about, that contracting and where all of this is going. Really, really cool conversation. But again, it's becoming more standardized while still allowing for flexibility at the state level. And even some of the larger county levels for that matter. So we do see it as an evolving space, and evolving in a way that's actually more beneficial for our customers rather than less. So that is exciting to look forward to.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting to point out as well, like it's not necessarily commoditized, being that states have different makeups between rural and more developed areas, and high resolution and more on the 30 centimeter spectrum of resolution. So I think it's interesting to talk about that as well. Every state has different needs. So we do, at the end of the day, have maybe not a custom process, but I would not say that the industry is commoditized.
Never one size fits all, right?
Yeah.
And the last shading to that is, like, you will see more flexibility if it's for internal use for your organization, as compared to I am creating a derivative to sell to the marketplace, right? There is kind of a kind of conversation there, but high level, that's kind of the last comment that the last shading I can put to, like, this custom process where there's a conversation.
All right.
Hexagon does provide excellent rural coverage as well. So when you talk about a state level and you talk about the total coverage of the state, whereas we have seen providers in the past do more of a patchwork approach, Hexagon does fly the entire state within a very short period of time, relatively, for high resolution imagery.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, that ends the questions. I think I'll wrap it up with that today. If there's anything else that our panelists would like to add in, that's great. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that you can join us for another webinar in the near future.
And no problem for those questions. We always appreciate them. Having the opportunity to engage with you, our audience, is one of our favorite parts of doing these webinars. And, I think I'm getting a text from Rich Grady that it's Guinness time. So I think with that, we will end things for today and talk to you all in the next webinar.
Thanks, everyone.